Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. Today I'm here with the two hosts of Kazingram Dialogue. Up top is IJ. Well, depending on how the recording comes out. For me, up top is IJ, and at bottom is Amos. So let me just have both of them introduce themselves, and from there we'll start talking about God, theism, atheism, and doubt. So how about IJ, you start, and then we'll go to Amos.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm IJ. I have a background in philosophy. I did my MA in philosophy, and my thesis was on the problem of evil in philosophy of religion and ethics. And I fall under the category of Thomist, of being a Thomist, so a follower of Aquinas. I think Suan is also a Thomist, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So that's my background.
Amos.
So I'm Amos. I know IJ. We were roommates when we were doing our undergrad together. So we both took philosophy courses and theology courses together. Went to a small evangelical liberal arts college called Tyndale, and I went off afterwards to do my MA in theology. I'm quite interested in Thomism as well. My thesis was on Aquinas and his doctrine of analogy and how he uses that to develop his doctrine of the Trinity in the Summa. Mm-hmm. I think I'm a Thomist, but I'm quite interested in church fathers and sort of the history of theology more generally speaking. So.
All right, that's awesome. So just to introduce myself to you then. So I run the page Intellectual Conservatism. I've run it since I think 2018. And the page was the result of me after the 2016 election going from democratic socialist to conservative and opening myself up to like Thomistic thinking, conservative philosophy. And then eventually when I got into college, I got really into theology, really into philosophy. So actually right now I'm an undergraduate student at Kansas State University. I'm studying philosophy. I'm also doing metaphysics, ethics, and and philosophy of religion. And yeah, I really like how both of you guys have focused on Thomism. I'm very interested in the problem of evil, especially with my ethics background. I'm also interested in the arguments for the existence of God and just various other issues like applied ethics. So that's kind of the areas that I cover. So I just want to get to know kind of how you guys became Thomists or how you guys came to your philosophical kind of position. So, I can start off with my story and then I can hear your guys's if that's okay.
Yeah,
do it.
Yeah. So when I was in high school, I was a democratic socialist, right? So basically during that time, I grew up in kind of my background, right? So I'm from northeastern India, originally from the state of Manipur, the Churachandpur district, a small village called Lamka. That's where I'm from. So my father came here to study theology in 2000. And then, I was born, I think, January 12, 2000. And then a few months or sometime later, my dad comes to the United States. And then the rest of the family is able to join him in 2001. And then after that, growing up, I had a lot of influences. I grew up in a predominantly liberal part of Kansas. That's where I live currently. And I just kind of always grew up thinking that conservatives were kind of crazy and that, liberal Christians were more intelligent, right? And, also growing up too, I was a very devout Christian and I really took seriously what the Bible said. But then there came a point in my high school career where I was kind of like, man, I don't really know how to square myself with some of the more controversial conservative teachings of the Bible on marriage and so forth. So then eventually, the 2016 election came around and it was a very volatile time, and I just saw how angry and upset everybody was, and I kind of entered this period of disenchantment with liberalism. And eventually I discovered the work of Sir Roger Scruton, who has written on beauty, on conservatism, and I developed a friendship with him online via email, and that really impacted and changed my life. And then at the same time I started reading Robert George, Ryan Anderson, St. Thomas Aquinas. And that just kind of opened the gate for me to becoming a conservative and feeling intellectually responsible in the process. And then from high school to college, I've had all sorts of other kind of realizations, and we can talk about that. But yeah, the problem of evil has always been kind of something that's been on my mind. When I was in high school for a bit, I actually did have a fallout with my faith, so I went from Christian to agnostic for a period of time. And I remember I sent my question to William Lane Craig on the Reasonable Faith,
Yes.
you know, what do you call that? The website, you know, the Q&A.
Website, yeah.
And he actually responded to my question, and he
Wow, that's awesome.
demolished my objections and my arguments. And I was like, man, I felt embarrassed, you know, but it was a good kind of humbling for me. And then from there, you know, I was just like, okay, I got to pick up the pieces again. And my journey since high school has been really picking up those pieces, studying Christianity, studying history, studying theology, studying philosophy, and understanding kind of orthodoxy with a little o better. So, you know, whichever one of you wants to take it away, I'd like to hear your story.
Amos, why don't you go first?
Sure. Yeah. I sort of had, I was brought up on the east coast of Canada. It's an island off the east coast called Newfoundland. You know, my parents were Christians, evangelicals, and I was sort of brought up in the faith that way. I did have some doubts in high school, but I don't think I ever completely moved away from the faith, though I, you know, was fairly agnostic for a while. Um, yeah, and I guess through a young adult group at my church, I started to read things like, you know, C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity, other things like that, and become interested in theology and philosophy. And so I started my undergrad hoping to double major in both of those. And I did a lot of biblical study stuff in my undergrad, so like some criticism, historical studies on like the, you know, Jewish background of the New Testament, things like that. And I was introduced to the Church Fathers by a theology prof there. And yeah, I grew pretty interested in them. So I started reading like Augustine, Gregory Nyssa. And then he strongly suggested that I do a course with him on Metaphysics of Aquinas. And so we started reading like Ed Fazer and Joseph Owens and other sort of neo-Thomists like that. And it sort of spurred my interest more. And I started to read more and more like St. Thomas, especially when I started my master's. I took a course where, the professor was a Barthian, and so he's quite critical of the Thomistic project. So I sort of, a lot of my Thomism is self-taught, but I've sort of fallen in love with it.
Yeah, Amos and I have a very similar story in that because we were in undergrad together. And in terms of like where I'm from, Suan and I are actually from the same state. So I'm from Manipur as well. I was born in Imphal, which I think is you're from Churachandpur, right? Area.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's like 2 hours away.
Yeah, something like that.
I think something like that. So we're
Wow.
we're probably related somehow if we went back far enough.
Yeah, I bet.
So yeah, I got interested in Thomism through the same professor, Craig Carter, who's written a book called Interpreting Scripture with a Great Tradition. It's a great book.
I have that book actually.
Oh, you do? Okay,
yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah. So he has a new book coming out, which is a follow-up from that book. But he was the first one to introduce me to Thomistic thought. I would say more generally classical theistic thought. And at that point, I'd never really come across it. And I was like, actually, when I first came across it, I misunderstood simplicity for simple. Simplicity for simple. So in my papers, I would sometimes put simplicity, and he'd be like, no, you mean simple. And I was like, simple. And so anyways, I thought about that a lot. So I started reading Fazer's book. I believe it was his Aquinas book. That's when I was first really like kind of got my intro into like Thomistic metaphysics. And then from there, I basically tried to get my hands on any Thomistic books. Read Oderberg, Whipple, Owens, obviously. Amos and I both read Owens as well. Read all the articles. And then when I went to my grad school, I was at St. Mary's, and you know, as Catholic sounding as that school is, there's nothing Catholic about that school. I'll tell you a funny story. There's the head of Catholic theology there at St. Mary's, the religious department. She didn't know I was a Christian, right? So she just knew I was a philosophy student. And so I would frequent the religious department just to ask questions. And there was also an Islamic studies professor, and I was reading Avicenna at that point. So I was reading Avicenna and Aquinas. So I would go there just to kind of like prod asked. So then I met the Catholic studies the head of Catholic studies. And I was talking to her and I was like, okay, so, within Catholicism, you guys believe that Jesus is God, right? Obviously I was being facetious. And she goes, well, no, not really. The idea that Jesus is God is actually came about in the first Council of Nicaea, 325. And I was like, well, I don't know if that's true, because I'm pretty sure St. Paul in your scripture, St. Paul seems to refer to Jesus as God. He's a son of God or son of man or whatever. And Jesus seems to have thought that he was God in some way. He referred to himself as son of man. And he wasn't crucified because he was blaspheming and claiming to be God. And she's like, well, no, that's just our interpretation of Jesus. The best way to understand Jesus is, I forget what, I think she referred to Wittgenstein, and she said, Jesus is the language through which we understand God, but not God himself. Anyways, I'm here laughing because, I was like, I thought you were supposed to be the Catholic studies, the head of Catholic studies or Catholic theology here. So I did Problem of Evil. My supervisor is a hardcore atheist, Mark Mercer. He was on our podcast, Kazingram Dialogue. He was like one of the first guys. He's a friend of mine, but he was very good. One thing I really appreciated about him was that even though he disagreed with pretty much every single thing I wrote in my thesis, he, as a good philosopher should, he was able to look at it and said, okay, your arguments are valid, they're sound here, and was able to give me very, very good feedback. And my external was Stephen Baldner. He's a Thomist out in St. of X, I think. I think St. of X, right, Amos? Stephen Baldner?
I'm not sure.
I think so. So yeah, I did that. So my Thomistic studies was like Amos, very much like Amos. It is self-taught. Just reading. I can't read Latin, just to put it out there. Amos and I have had this disagreement over the importance of reading Latin when reading Aquinas. I've said, well, if I could get a great translation of the Summa or any of Aquinas' work in English, why do I have to be able to read Latin? But Amos and I disagree on this. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so I did that, and my thesis was on the problem of evil, and specifically I was arguing that, look, when we're talking about evil, you have to understand what we're referring to by the word evil and by when we say God. So the problem of evil, we can't say, oh, look, here's evil. If this instance of evil exists, God doesn't exist. This doesn't really make sense, because we have to understand what that is. And ultimately, I ended up arguing that evil is best understood under the privation theory. And then from there, what happens is, if you assume the privation theory of evil is true, then for any instance of evil to be in existence, in reality, existence as in it happening, you necessarily require existence itself, or something that is holding the existence of these things that are suffering evil. And so that was my argument, and somewhat very controversial, I would say, my argument. And I made it very clear. I said, look, this is a controversial topic that I'm writing on, and especially the argument itself. So that is my background in philosophy.
All right. So, I'm really interested in actually talking about your master's thesis. So both of you, what you kind of covered, let me start with IJ, and then I'll go to Amos, and we'll just kind of talk about the work that we've done. So I've actually also written on the problem of evil. Was it during my freshman year, I developed a theodicy, and then recently I've been doing a series of debates. Well, I think they've died down now, but I did some debates on universalism with Samuel Watkinson. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's a friend of mine online. Okay. So basically, I developed this theodicy from St. Augustine, and the argument was very similar to yours. I mean, coming from that classical theist background. But the argument that I basically raised was the theodicy is called the two worlds theodicy. And it's trying to perfect both the free will theodicy and the soul-making theodicy, right? Mm-hmm. So Augustine believed, actually, that God could have created a free and morally perfect world. And I don't know if you'll grant that assumption or not, but we can discuss and hash that out, right? But, God could have created a free and morally perfect world, but he chose not to. So Augustine kind of, and Plantinga later develops this argument too, but it's the O Felix culpa argument, right? That, the reason why God chose to first have a world of imperfection and then a world of perfection is because he wanted to maximize the exercise of the virtues of love and justice, right? In my theodicy, I said, well, that seems to be the wrong place to maximize, right? Because God doesn't have to maximize anything if he's already in himself essentially perfect. It has to be something about the created order itself that it was worth going through the trouble of first an imperfect world and then a perfect world. So I talked about in my theodicy how I think that God wants to maximize the clash between good and evil, and that there's some kind of moral profundity in that, right? So, you could have a world in which you have moral perfection, but you have no evil at all, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's different from a world in which agents have the reality of choosing the good, the reality of choosing evil, and they nonetheless choose the good. There's something more profound about that sort of love and devotion. And because God, in his essential perfection, right, is not obligated to kind of prove anything to us, right? He's not the sort of agent like us who has to constantly, for instance, in order for me to be considered virtuous, I have to perform actions from my being that demonstrate my virtue in a sense, right? So act follows being. But God, because, his being and his act are one and the same, right? He doesn't have to have that kind of demonstrative burden. So then the argument that I made was that basically when we look into the creation, there has to be some feature of it, and this feature has to be this kind of more profundity where good and evil are given their maximal reign and virtue is able to reach its maximal depth. And I use the example of even someone like Martin Luther King, right, standing up against racism in the South. It makes his virtue of love and kindness and forgiveness all the more profound in the face of that great evil. And even with the example of Christ, right? Christ in the face of his executioners saying, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. That kind of love and profundity in and of itself, has, I think, to God, immense value and worth. And I think, that's a pretty intuitive premise, right? Identifying that. So then I basically say, look, other attempts to kind of, use Mackey's logical problem of evil don't work, because if God's trying to maximize this kind of profundity, and it seems to me at least worthwhile, then the argument holds, right? You can't have any compromises on that if you're trying to get the maximal range of good and the maximal range of evil.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the argument that I raised, and it leads to the conclusion that universalism, at least I think it leads to the conclusion that universalism can't be true. But I'm interested in your argument, IJ. So sorry, that was kind of my long-winded
No, that's fine.
introduction.
I'm actually I wanted to ask you. So
Sure.
I have become more favorable towards John Hick's understanding of how he understands evil and why evil's in the world. His soul-making theodicy. When I first came across it, I thought it was one of the. I'm not dumb, but I thought it was just ridiculous is the best word. I thought, this is kind of ridiculous. But I think over the years, I've come to realize that the suffering that we endure, it's to somewhat use Viktor Frankl's his own take. Our attitude towards us, the suffering that we face, determines how we determines what we become, right? So there is a sense in which suffering is needed. At least it seems to me that it's needed for, like you were saying, for us to act virtuously. There's no reason to act virtuously. There is reason, but there's the acting of virtues becomes more valuable when you are doing so in a situation wherein it's very difficult, right? And that, I think, is true in almost all instances where you want to get better at something. If you want to get better at if you want to become better human being, you have, unfortunately, I think you do have to go through some sort of suffering. I think the suffering really does burn away all the hay, and it refines you, and that is something that I've learned over the past few years. And that's true of if you're doing that's true. Amos is gonna laugh because I bring this up. That's true of if you're doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, because that's what I do. You have to suffer to become better at learning how to control your opponent, strangle them, break their arms, break their foot, whatever. You have to suffer through that, to actually become better. And so it is analogous. And so what I wanted to know with yours is, and I think previously, right at the beginning, you were saying that it is possible that, okay, so my question would be more so, do you think it is possible for God to make a world wherein nobody commits evil?
Oh yeah, like, so basically, yeah, so the theodicy presupposes, and I think it's justified to say that I think God could have created a free and morally perfect world. So evil is not essential to having a morally perfect world. Now, so the depth of goodness, however, would be different, right? Because if it's metaphysically secured that you're never going to commit evil, now it's different from a world in which you can actually experience the reality of evil, actually have really chosen the alternate reality of evil, and all that. So yeah, the theodicy does suppose that God could have created free and morally perfect world initially.
So how would you understand what evil is?
Yeah, so I also accept the privation account, right? But I think that what this really hinges on is your definition of freedom. So for instance, there are like three counterexamples to the claim that, in order for us to be free, we need to have evil. And just another fact too. I'm almost tempted to. I'm very skeptical of the the principle of alternative possibilities, right, for being necessary for free will. And I don't know. I saw Amos smile a little bit. Maybe he's got something to say with that too.
Oh no, I'm just thinking of a friend IJ and I have who's a staunch defender of the principle of alternative possibilities. So I don't think it's that important.
Yeah. Well, like, so for instance, take God, right? So God cannot possibly conceivably, right, because he's, essential perfection, right, perform an evil action. But we don't want to say that God's not free, right? And then even someone like Craig will say that God is free because there are no external kind of irrational motivators or factors that are compelling his decisions. All right. And then also likewise, Jesus, fully God, fully human, truly human, right? Hypostatically unified in himself. And Christ, right, there are no possible worlds, if you will, in which Christ commits an evil action, right? So then we don't want to say that that Christ isn't free, that Christ, or that, if we say that all human beings commit evil, and therefore Christ is a human, therefore Christ commits evil. We don't want to really commit ourselves to that syllogism, right? And say that's a necessary component of freedom. Likewise, the question about whether or not we'll have free will in heaven. I think the unanimous answer throughout history and even now is that, yeah, we are going to have free will. We're not going to become deterministic robots as soon as we die, right? So even in heaven, there's not the possibility of us committing evil, right? At least that's the assumption, right? If we're going to have sanctified bodies and be redeemed. So Augustine has this idea that, well, look, everybody could have been created initially perfect then, right? So it has to be the case that there was something that God found valuable in first having us be imperfect in order for him to go through that trouble, or for us to go through that trouble, rather.
I wonder though, see, I don't know if I agree with it, only because all things other than God, all things other than existence itself is a composite of essence and existence, and hence by nature has potentiality in some way or some form. And as a result of that, I would think that it's impossible. I'm inclined to say that it's impossible to create a world wherein evil is impossible to create a world wherein evil doesn't exist, only because the creatures or the things that exist in any world in which God creates are going to be composites of essence and existence, and by virtue of that are going to have potentials and evils. At least if you hold to a privation theory, it's, privations are some good due to an X, right? It's not any old privation like, oh, I can't run as fast as a cheetah, therefore it's evil. Well, that's not the case. It's not evil that I can't run as fast as a cheetah, because qua me being a human being, I shouldn't be able to run as fast as a cheetah. But me being a human being, let's just assume that I know what the essence of a human being is. I ought to have two eyes and I only have one eye, therefore it's evil. Or as a human being, I ought to have two legs, I only have one leg. So I have wondered if it is even possible to create a world wherein there is no evil, because at least a world wherein the possibility of evil doesn't even occur, because any world in which there is something other than God, the possibility of evil, at least understood within the privation theory, is always going to be a possibility, because it's just a deviation of their telos. And, you know, if something fails to achieve that telos, or fails to be in constant communion, or heading towards that telos, we would say it's an evil, at least if you hold to the privation theory.
Yeah. So IJ, is your argument then that that just because in virtue of created things having potentiality, there's always the potentiality for evil, but it doesn't mean it's ever, you know, there's possible worlds where that potentiality is not actualized, or, you know, where a potentiality is left unactualized rather?
Yeah, I think so. Even though I don't like the term possible worlds, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, two things, right? So we can, for the sake of argument, kind of exclude the example of God, because God is kind of his own unique, you know, I don't even want to say he's, well, you know, analogically speaking, he's a unique being, right?
Yeah.
He's not a being among beings. So we can exclude that example, but still the example of Christ and even the eschaton, right? When we're going to be fully redeemed, right? And we're going to presumably have free will, but not be able to perform evil actions, right?
Yeah.
That still lingers on my mind, those two counterexamples.
But what if you take purgatory, and that's, you know, and if one goes to purgatory, if they don't like the term purgatory, you can say Miami Beach. You know, you go, after you die, you go to Miami Beach to cleanse yourself of your evil inclinations, or your desires to do that which is not actually good.
Sure.
You're apprehending the wrong things all the time. And so when you're in Miami Beach, you work towards having your inclinations towards the good. So that when you eventually get to heaven, or whatever state it is, the possibility of committing evil is there. It's not going to go, but because you're inclined towards always doing the good, you never commit the evil. So the purgatory, at least in my mind, I've come around to it. For purgatory, I mean, that's what it seems to make sense. Otherwise, it doesn't really make. I'm weary to say that God could create a world wherein, or we could be in a state wherein the possibility of committing evil is not there. Does that make sense? I mean, you're more than free to
Yeah, so I've talked about, so one of the things I talked about in my paper too was like this Augustinian idea of potentiality, right? So what can you properly say is the potential of something, right? So for instance, you know, after purgatory, you know, and let's just call it purgatory, right? I'm not opposed to the idea, right? So let's say that after purgatory, you're fully kind of purified, right? So your will is not disordered anymore. Your intellect properly grasps the good, and your will and intellect don't have any opposition, right? So when your intellect grasps the good, your appetite of will also grasps the truth and is moved to act in the following way. And it's never, let's say, going to falter, right? I mean, at that point, then the question becomes, well, is it really a potential then for you to commit evil if you have this perfection of the will and the intellect? You could say, well, I could imagine, right, you committing some evil, right, because, you know, and you can contemplate it, right? But then that kind of runs the scenario kind of, you know, Hume had this argument against causation where he says, well, no, I can imagine something popping out into existence out of nothing. It's like, well, okay, you know, just as you said, you were hesitant about the possible worlds talk, we need some kind of limiting principle. And I think if I'm not mistaken, this is called modal actualism, right? Where possibilities have to be grounded in actualities.
Yeah.
So for instance, if I'm going to talk about a possible world, it can't just be totally out of the blue. It has to be based on some actuality in reality, right? So for instance, you know, Augustine has this idea that if you're going to say that human beings really have the potential to commit evil, then it has to be the case that sometime in the timeline of human existence, someone does in fact commit evil. So for instance, let's say that we live in a world where we say, yeah, we have the potential to fly, right? And then you wait and you sit and nobody ever flies. And in fact, in all possible worlds, let's say nobody ever in fact flies, but this person insists, no, it's a real potential. At that point, then we can say, well, it's an imaginary hypothetical potential, but not a real one. So then in the case of just tying this all back, right, to the example about what was it? It was just after we're purified, right, through purgatory, right? I would say that it's not a real potential for us to commit evil after that point. We can call it a hypothetical potential, but if purgatory really did what purgatory is supposed to do, and heaven is what heaven is, and the eschaton is what it's supposed to be, then the possibility of evil is not really there. It can't be really there. In the same way that the possibility for us to committing evil now is really there. And just to bring this back, right? This was the argument that I was picking up on in my theodicy. And, I read papers by other atheist philosophers who also picked up on Augustine's point. And they said, wait, if this is a real possibility, like, for instance, J.L. Mackie, right? Then, the argument still stands. There's a question on why didn't God begin with a perfect world? So then the theist has to show, well, why did we first have a world of imperfection and then a world of perfection?
Mm-hmm. So are you saying in purgatory, the nature is changed such that the possibility or potentiality of committing evil no longer exists?
I would say so, yeah. Right. So the intellect and the will, let's see here. I mean, so depending on your theology, right? Like, we're born in original sin, which means that we have an inclination towards damnation, towards evil. And then we remove the stain of original sin through whatever sacramental view you have. And then still we have concupiscence, which is this general kind of like recognition of evil, and it so kind of pulls on us sometimes, but because of grace, because of Christ's work, we have the ability to avoid concupiscence, or to overcome rather the pull of evil. And then it's not until post-death and resurrection that we're made totally perfect, because even Paul talks about glorified bodies, right? And I wouldn't think now that in the flesh, or that our flesh would necessarily be the same tainted sort of substance after resurrection, after glorification.
Yeah, I'll have to think about that. I never really considered whether purgatory would change one's nature such that the possibility of committing evil would just fly out. It changes the nature completely. So I have to think about that.
Yeah, and what was the other thing I was going to say? Yeah, I mean, and my view of purgatory is not that, right? So there's a difference between, let's say, perfection and merit, right? So, and just to keep this in mind, right? So the idea is that in purgatory, I mean, so I like to use this analogy, right? Imagine that you have like a Word document with your philosophy paper on it, and let's say there are a few typos, right? Purgatory is kind of like fixing the typos and getting the proper kind of structure and everything. But then but then the merit of the argument in your philosophy paper is not going to change just because I fixed the grammar, because I fixed the spelling, right? So it's like the merit is still the same. How you lived your life is still going to, determine your place in the heavenly hierarchy in the afterlife. But your perfection is there, right? You're meeting that bottom line perfection of what's needed to enter heaven and be in God's presence.
Yeah, I think you get your hierarchy in the heavenly realms increases the hotter chili you can eat.
Yeah. But just in terms of changed natures, I think like the theological tradition seems to place quite an emphasis on the beatific vision in changing a person's nature. Just the idea that seeing the essence of God will overflow into your will and will sort of like disperse itself throughout your whole body, such that it takes on divine-like qualities. And there does seem to be, like Aquinas in the in a work that's not often read, his compendium talks about how the will becomes immobile in the beatific vision, and it just becomes, because the vision is supposed to be of God's goodness, which is goodness itself, is so intense, you won't will anything else, and there's
becomes
a sense
irresistible.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, that's interesting. Yeah. So, I mean, we can move on now if you want to just
Sure.
talking about. Yeah, that was a nice little, aside. I mean, Amos, do you want to talk about your master's thesis or?
Yeah. So I dealt with Barthian misreadings of Aquinas. So there's a common accusation amongst Barth's students and a number of his followers that like the Aquinas or the Thomistic Analogia Entis sort of introduces a sort of foreign metaphysics into theology, and it's something that's not biblical and distorts the biblical presentation of the Trinity and Christology. And so I sort of argued against it, and just went through a lot of their arguments and showed how they were misreading Aquinas, misrepresenting him. They failed to note the sort of biblical and exegetical background of a number of his things, like the proposition that God is being itself, subsistent being itself, is very much grounded in his exegesis of Exodus 3:14, where God reveals himself to be I am who I am. His doctrine of analogy is very much tied up with his doctrine of participation, which in turn follows very closely from his understanding of creation as bringing a composite of existence and essence into being and sustaining it in being. So yeah, I sort of just moved through the first 45 questions of the Summa and exegeted those with Barthian counter arguments in mind.
When you say Barthian, you're talking about Karl Barth, or?
Yeah, I'm talking about Karl Barth and a number of his students. So, people like Panneberg, Moltmann, Eberhard Jungel, and other German theologians and people influenced by them. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of maybe, talk about your thesis a little bit too. I've noticed that right now there's a lot of interest in debates on divine simplicity, on the nature of the classical theist God. And there's been actually surprisingly a lot of pushback, and what are your thoughts on that pushback? And, it sounds like it has a historical basis, right, in the 20th century, but does it go further back, or?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people would trace it back to, with once nominalism arose and you sort of had the logical working through of rationalism and empiricism, you come to Kant, and you can no longer, from the phenomena, you no longer have access to the noumena, especially when those noumena are beyond all the categories. So, God is being itself. It doesn't exist in any of the categories. Kant just thinks it's completely absurd. And so there's an attempt to reconstruct theology, especially with borrowing from Hegel, that sort of attempts to reconstruct a theology from within the world and sort of do away with the transcendentals, do away with simplicity, and sort of just start from biblical theology. And I think that's a root of a lot of the problems. Yeah, I'm not sure if that gets to your question.
Yeah, I mean, so it goes back basically around, so some people will try to pin nominalism on William of Ockham. There's some basis, but, at least it becomes more prominent, right, during the Enlightenment, and then,
there's the language, the conversation about analogy and univocal and equivocal language was it for a while quite dismissed. It's like, well, it's not really important. And when classical theism right now is it's not having its shine, but people are starting to pick up on it and saying, oh yeah, actually this is a much more sophisticated way of dealing with quite a lot of the problems that are facing modern theology. But when it comes to analogical language, and we've had, and this is not to downplay our professors at all, but our professors, when we were at Tyndale, they're both very, very good and analytic philosophers, and as a result of that, both of them are somewhat apprehensive of an analogical language to an extent. And so, we both, Amos and I, because we did philosophy, that we kind of came up with that, some being apprehensive towards analogical language. But once, I think, if you end up accepting, God as existence itself, it becomes quite difficult not to employ analogical language, or at least hold to analogical language. Otherwise, you can't really make sense anymore. You have this massive divide.
Yeah, and especially if you arrive at the conclusion that God is existence itself through traditional means of argumentation. So the 5 ways, the existential proof in De Essentia, they all sort of point to a metaphysics of participation where all being is derived from God. And so there has to be some sort of overlap between the being of creation and the being of God that makes possible, our speaking meaningfully of him in our everyday language.
Yeah. And just for like the audience, if they're not familiar with analytic philosophy, basically the move of analytic philosophy, if I'm understanding it properly, is to try and reduce ambiguity in language as much as possible, to the point where you had like people like, I think, Rudolf Carnap talking about the elimination of metaphysics, right? So he said, we got to throw out all these terms, being, essence, and so forth. And then, he developed his own sophisticated system, but even Quine wanted to reduce metaphysics down to just natural science and do away with, talking about, uninstantiated potentials or, that sort of thing. And, even in my metaphysics class, and I just started recognizing that you really can't get away from these terms, and you can't fully, break them down and, kind of mechanistically take them apart, but you kind of have an intuitive grasp of what they mean. And to some extent, it's not just the fact that they're useful, but it seems to be that they're logically prior. So, using Otterberg's argument for the reality of essence, right? They're logically prior to our analysis of being able to individuate between objects, right? It's not just the case that we're saying that matter is arranged tree-wise, right? Because what does it mean for something to be arranged tree-wise? Well, it has to be logically prior to our analysis, not a priori prior, I think, but like, when we analyze it, we have to already suppose that it is a unity of some sorts that our intellect grasps.
Yeah, like the substance metaphysics is sort of the condition of our language being able to apply to reality in a straightforward way.
Yeah. So, Thomistic epistemology, right? Bringing that into the debate. But yeah, I mean, like another thing too, real quick, is that for us, right, metaphysics is prior to epistemology. It's not epistemology being, before metaphysics.
And that is somewhat controversial to say. I think we've had some friends that we've disagreed with over which one comes first, metaphysics or epistemology, and it always kind of seemed odd to me that you would put epistemology before metaphysics, because when you're doing epistemology, you're assuming a lot of metaphysical principles in doing it. So it doesn't make sense, at least in my mind, it doesn't make sense that you would put epistemology before metaphysics, but lots of people do.
Yeah,
Smarter people.
Yeah, I don't know. I think there's always an inconsistency. Like every discussion about how we come to know objects assumes certain things about the natures of those objects. So there's at least a minimal metaphysics that goes on in people who try to prioritize epistemology.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, we can move on to now. I think we have a good bouncing point to talk about God and doubts about the existence of God. But what is it? I've kind of noticed this too. When it comes to, for instance, I'll talk to my professors who are atheists, right, about the existence of God, or I'll talk about particularly Aquinas, and they'll try to oftentimes they're just people straw man Aquinas, or they really kind of downplay the significance and sophistication of his philosophy, right? And I remember one time too, I had this professor who really didn't like Aquinas. So I sat down and talked to him, and I said, okay, so you're familiar with the convertibility principle, you're familiar with principle of proportionate causality, and blah, 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 blah. And he said, I have no idea what you're talking about, right? So this person who was bashing scholastic philosophy, saying it was anti-science, had no idea what the core principles of the philosophy actually are. And then he was just saying to the class, right, yeah, this is crazy, whatever. So let me forward this suggestion to everybody, right? So oftentimes people will say, well, look, the majority of academia right now, they're naturalists, they're atheists. Doesn't that show an indication of truth? I'm inclined to say no, right? And I mean, you have people like Rob Kuhn saying that if the quantum revolution happened after the scientific revolution, then we would have all been Aristotelian still. And, what was it? I'll close with this, and I want to get your thoughts, right? There's an economist that I like a lot. I don't know if you know him. His name is Richard Epstein. And he talked about when he was at Yale Law School, he was surrounded by people who were smarter than him. And he said, yes, I admit that they were smarter than me. But the difference between me and them is that I had the correct starting principles while they were trying to rationalize the impossible, right? And I think that's kind of a helpful way of thinking about even the people who are really intelligent, like, for instance, Graham Oppie and other atheist philosophers who we disagree with. They're so intelligent. But to some extent, I think at the core, if you really pinpoint them on the weak spots of their philosophy, it seems as if to me they're trying to rationalize the impossible. What are your thoughts on that?
That's an interesting point. I think one thing that is interesting, it reminds me of, is there is the idea of appealing to brute fact when it comes to philosophy. That pisses me off personally when it's like, oh, it's brute fact. It's like, wow, it's like, oh, it's like saying, I slapped you. That's why. It's like, oh, it doesn't really make sense, at least in my mind. And that is common. I think there was Eric, I forget what the philosopher's name is, something Eric Weinenberg, or
Wielenberg,
Wielenberg. He has the objective morality, without God, and he appeals to like brute fact as how he justifies objective morality without God is just brute fact that it's there. Property of being goodness, property of being evil just instantiates when you do these things. There is. I have a lot of. Amos, why don't you go?
Sure.
I'll go after you.
I mean, when it comes to things like brute facts, you need to be able to explain why they're brute facts. And so that's definitely one shortcoming of Weilenberg's approach. But, to your question, Swan, I think there is a tendency to justify the impossible, but often I think that there's a lot of contemporary academics who are quite dismissive of, say, Thomism in the classical tradition don't seem to be that familiar with it. I think the majority of colleges don't really place an emphasis on students learning the classical canon of philosophy and metaphysics, or if they do, maybe it would be like, you get some basic Plato and Aristotle and then skip to Descartes. I don't know how much it is trying to justify the impossible rather than actually just trying to start off being cut off from these solutions and slowly working their way back towards them. Because I think like since analytic philosophy started, it's quite interesting to see how it's gone from the attempt to reduce all the problems of philosophy to problems of language, to introducing through semantics possible world metaphysics, and now there's things like causal dispositions are playing a big role in philosophy of science, and it seems to slowly be making its way back towards teleology. And so there's this sort of a blind attempt to rediscover a lot of this wisdom that has been lost.
It seems though, I don't know how that's going to happen, because right now there's within academia, because of critical theory taking a big hold within most academic fields and has seeped into philosophy, and I've noticed this over the years. Now they're trying to cancel Aristotle. They're trying to cancel reading the big book, the great books, because it's intrinsically racist. And so that is something you really do have to wonder if it's, if the problem is, like Amos was saying, if the real problem is just the fact that there is a lack of there's a lack of historical understanding from between the medieval period. It's not even just like Christian medieval period that philosophers, contemporary philosophers don't know. It's medieval Islamic philosophy that they don't even know. Even I mean, the only person within Judaism, medieval Judaism, that I have read is Maimonides. So I'm ignorant in that area as well. But in terms of like consensus of the academia, it doesn't really work that way, right? Just because you have a consensus, just because there's a consensus among peer groups that X is true or God doesn't exist, for example, doesn't make it the case that God doesn't exist. I mean, it seems to be very common. This is what I don't understand. It seems to be very common within certain scientific studies, or I should more specifically, scientific journalists who will say, oh, there's a consensus between 98% of the scientists, I have nothing against climate change, but this 98% of the scientists believe climate change is real, therefore climate change is real. It's like, well, that's not how science works. It doesn't work on consensus basis. It's not like, hey, Suwan, what do you think of climate change? Well, you're a scientist. IJ, what do you think? Amos, what do you think? Oh, we all agree, therefore climate change is true. It doesn't work that way. Neither does it work in philosophy. They do these studies. I believe it's like 3% of all philosophers are theists, or maybe it's slightly more. I saw it on Daily News a few years back. But within philosophy of religion, the number obviously increases between how many philosophers of religion are theists and how many are not theists. But that doesn't make it the case. Like, just because, let's just say 95% of all philosophers believe that God doesn't exist, doesn't make it true, which most philosophers obviously would agree with me, doesn't make it true that, God doesn't exist. But people, it doesn't necessarily translate to the majority of people. They don't think, we tend to appeal to consensus as a way to function in the world, because it's the easiest way to function in the world if there are consensus.
And just to look more closely at the number of atheist philosophers, right? You've had people like the atheist philosopher Quentin Smith talk about how the theist philosophers of religion are among the best, right? And I think he even said something like, if you locked all the atheist and theist philosophers of religion in a library and you forced them to argue for 72 hours, you would find, like, consistently the theist philosophers were always better. So, I mean, and even among some atheist grad students that I know, they all kind of admit, yeah, the quality of theistic philosophy, at least in academia today, is much better than atheistic philosophy. And even some of them will say, like, a lot of it's really embarrassing how bad the atheist philosophers are in their arguments, So it's not as if the consensus is so big that it's also like it has the brightest minds as well, right? And I don't mean to diss, right, other atheist philosophers, because there are many good ones out there, right? I'm not denying that, right? But that number alone shouldn't really be that comforting to you when you look at the quality of the work being produced between the atheist and the theist camps. I think people have talked about how the Blackwell Companion of Natural Theology is really a tour de force, and atheism doesn't have anything comparable to it.
Yeah.
It is true. I mean, the one thing though is interesting is even within philosophy, you generally see jumps within philosophy. Like, you'll have periods of, that's just on, if you have logical positivism for a period of time, and then it just like jumps, and then it jumps again, and then it jumps again. And right now we have the sense where I would say theistic philosophers right now in our contemporary period have it the best compared to any other period. And maybe that's because of Alan Planning and Craig that have paved the way. It's not embarrassing, or at least I'm told that it was embarrassing many, many years ago to be like, oh, I believe in God and I'm a philosopher. But there is something within analytic philosophy. There is a sense in which Alvin Plantinga is like the beginning forefather of Christian philosophy, which is not true. You had Catholic philosophers. I mean, maybe they weren't very good at interacting.
Elizabeth Anscombe and Peter Geach.
Yeah.
They're pretty central to a lot of the project of analytic philosophy, like Elizabeth Anscombe publishing Wittgenstein, and intention and other things like that.
Yeah, I mean, all to say, there just seems to be like these the history within philosophy doesn't really crawl. It more so makes these massive jumps. You have like Craig planning on doing solid work for many, many years, and then boom, all of a sudden you just see all their grad students from Notre Dame, Biola, just like coming out. Yeah, that's all I was saying.
All right, so I'm interested now in knowing about like what arguments or reasons have convinced you to believe in God. So whoever wants to take that first, I'm excited to hear what your answers are.
Amos, why don't you go first?
Yeah, sure. So I think the existential argument that Aquinas gives in De Ante et Essentia is probably the most convincing. Well, it's a difficult argument and it's very abstract, but I think it does the most work in terms of distinguishing God from creation and actually giving you a basis to elaborate the attributes of God in a way that's very clear, where maybe things like the argument from motion don't. So, for example, Aristotle was the first to give the argument from motion, but I'm actually a bit critical of Aristotle. I don't think he was a theist, properly speaking, because he takes the existence of the universe as a given, and he sees the unmoved mover as a being within the universe that only explains and accounts for motion in the universe rather than the being of the universe as a whole. And so it doesn't do the same explanatory work as, say, the argument from efficient causality, the argument from being, or any number of other scholastic arguments that clearly had a sharp distinction between creature and creation in mind.
Yeah. All right, IJ, do you want to go next, or?
Yeah, I would agree with Amos. I think the argument from existence in the De Ante is, in my opinion, probably the strongest argument for the existence of God. More so because when it comes to the act and potency distinction, that's another argument, obviously, an argument from change. I guess they could both fall into the same thing. But those arguments, I would say that is what brought me in, because it was much easier to understand act and potency distinction and going from there to actus purus. It's much easier to go. But over the years, I think going through it, and I used De Ante, Aquinas's argument in De Ante in my thesis, and I heavily leaned on it only because it does two things that sometimes can be difficult when you're having a conversation about the existence of God. One is, let's just say hypothetically that it turns out the universe existed infinitely, right? Somehow we find that out. Then a lot of theistic arguments, if we're talking about like fine-tuning argument or, the Kalam cosmological argument, for example, at least the way William Lane Craig understands it, he places emphasis on the Big Bang as, for his Kalam cosmological argument, and maybe he could place it somewhere else. But if it turned out it was infinite, the universe existed infinitely, there would be a lot of theists would have some sort of problem with it, because if it exists eternally, if it existed infinitely, and if we think God exists infinitely, then is the universe God? Is God and the universe, are they coexisting? Are we now all going to be Hindus because that's the way it goes? But if you study Aquinas's argument of essence and existence distinction, what you end up getting is, it doesn't really matter if the universe existed infinitely. It doesn't matter if there's a being outside of God that exists infinitely, so long as that being's essence and existence are in composition, and the essence of that creature is such that it doesn't have existence as a causal power, but the existence is a causally derived power. Then you always necessarily it has to derive from something that has its essence identical to its existence. And I think that is comforting in many, many ways, because you could have all these discoveries, or you could produce all these arguments. Like the problem of evil, in my opinion, is not really a problem at all, mainly because any instance of evil necessitates the existence. Any instance of evil necessitates a creatures whose existence and essence are in composition, and its existence doesn't derive from its own essence, and so it has to derive from God. So whenever there's evil, God's always going to be there. So the problem of evil doesn't really exist in my mind, and lots of people disagree with me. That's fine.
Well, so I'm interested in let's say that we're talking about our top three arguments. So I should be more specific, right? So, I think for both of you, your top argument is the De Ante, the existential proof, right? Yeah, same here. Yeah. So we all have that in common. what other arguments would you put in kind of your lineup? So what two, let's limit to two, right? What other two arguments would you put in your lineup?
Hmm. Yeah, that's tough. The argument,
I like how we're unanimous about the deente.
yeah, it's just the best one out there. You can't go wrong. Yeah, I think the argument from contingency and necessity, just that there's not really any state of affairs in the world that seems to carry the same, that seems to carry absolute necessity, and there needs to be something to ground the contingency of the world. I think that's a pretty hard-hitting argument.
That's interesting.
Yeah, the argument from efficient causality is it's fairly convincing to a modern reader. Aquinas obviously didn't intend it to be about a universe with a temporal beginning, but it's just about the argument from efficient causality is very similar to the argument from existence. But I think maybe the argument from efficient causality is quite convincing to modern readers who know that there's a temporal beginning to the universe. Yeah, that said, I still kind of really like teleological arguments because I do think they help clarify a lot concerning the character of God.
The argument from contingency, don't you think it's a bit too similar to the argument from existence? The argument?
The argument from efficient causality is as well. And if you really get into it and understand, say, the argument from degrees of perfection or morality, it's quite similar as well. It's just like it's a very subtle distinction they're making in metaphysics, and they're just looking at one aspect of being and developing it from there. So in terms of Thomistic arguments, they all carry.
They're similar.
Yeah, they're quite similar.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe. So Avicenna has this argument from contingency, I think, but he uses angels. If I remember correctly, he uses angels to make his argument. And when I first read it, I was quite excited. I was like, oh man, this thing's amazing. But thinking about it, I thought, oh, okay, maybe it's a bit too similar to the existential argument. And so I never really considered it until Amos brought it up again. But I was going to say the argument from change or acting potency. That was what initially drew me in and made me 100% convinced of theism. The acting potency, because it's intuitive. I would say it is intuitive, more intuitive than most other arguments, but at the same time, it can be. It stands up to most objections. I think there was a debate between Phaser and Graham Opie about that argument, or maybe it was on Unbelievable podcast with Justin Briley. And this was like, I had read his, I think it's 5 Proofs for the Existence of God. And I think it was on that. And I was listening to Opie's, I wanted to hear what his objections were. And, Phaser in his book did a very good job of defending acting potency argument, and even in the podcast. And so from then on, I was like, yeah, I guess it is a pretty good argument if you can defend it well and if you can present it well. And I mean, let's be honest, it's not always the easiest to present.
Yeah. Especially like, a lot of this Thomistic metaphysics is just so out of people's minds, and especially metaphysical realism, that if you're trying to sit down and talk to someone who has been educated, right, with like this kind of post-Aristotelian mindset, it's really hard to get them to think about these things, right? I mean, so I think, Phaser does a great job presenting this in a very simple way for people to understand. So just for me to add in what convinces me of God's existence, right? So one is the deente argument. I think so. When I talked to Rob Coons a while back on my channel, by the way, have you had him on your show yet?
No.
Should we have him?
Yeah. He loves doing interviews and talking to people, so he's always down for this sort of thing. Yeah, he's a great guy to talk to.
We'll have him. We'll send him an email or something. Or if you have his email, you send that.
Yeah, I mean, it's his UT Austin account, so you
Okay.
just
Yeah.
email him on his from there. But I was just gonna say, in our interview we talked about he said that on its own he doesn't think the ontological argument is going to totally work, and he doesn't think on its own the Kalam argument's going to work, right?
Right.
But he said that if you actually combine them together, then they can actually be really good for each other, because the ontological argument, I think what his argument was is that everything about it, I think he's defending Gödel's version, right? Everything about it works except for, the argument doesn't actually get you the premise, right, that God's existence is possible, right? So then he says, well, but if you supplement it with the Kalam argument, which he's done work with Alex Proust on, right, with the Grim Reaper paradox and so forth, and
Right.
other paradoxes on infinity to get to a first cause,
Mm-hmm.
then he says you can actually put the two together and get a really strong argument. And I know, like, he's gotten some flack because he's a Thomist, right? And Thomists generally haven't liked the ontological argument. But sometimes, at least in my estimation, I think the fourth way sounds like it could be made into a kind of ontological argument, right? But there's a question there. But at least for me, I find putting those two arguments together quite convincing. And then just to give you one last one, I just think a priori they're just really good arguments for theism.
Really?
Like, for instance, IJ's like, what?
Yeah, I'm kind of shocked as well.
Well, I mean, so for instance, when I did my conversation with Josh Rasmussen, I think he actually said the problem with theism is not that it predicts too little, but maybe it predicts too much, right? So he believes that theism a priori does a really great job making sense of our intuitions, making sense of a lot of features of the world. And I think if you say, like, given theism, it's more probable that you would see the features of our world. I would actually kind of agree. So, for instance, phenomenon like beauty, phenomenon like consciousness, like moral values and duties, even just like kind of the experience of the sublime and the transcendent. I take that quite seriously, especially human religious experience, right? When we look at them in light of, if we say given theism, this is more probable, right? So then maybe theism has some extra weight to it already. I mean, that's just kind of how I see it. But I recognize that for a lot of people, right, they're going to say, like, oh, I don't, when I look out of the world, right, if you're Richard Dawkins, I just see blind, pitiless indifference. But okay, so this is, I promise I'll wrap it up, right? But what I've noticed is that, like, when I look at the way that atheists live and the way that theists live, right, I've kind of noticed, Pascal talks about how, okay, suppose that you're on the fence and you really want to become a Christian, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're kind of intellectually 50-50, right? Pascal says, just go out and live as a Christian. Go out and talk to other Christians and be in the community, right? And then that's how you're going to finally get that final push, right? I think that sometimes in contemporary philosophy and how people view reason, they leave out experience, they leave out the rest of the human, the rest of what makes us human, right? The experience of beauty, the experience of love, of really, some people have talked about how what convinced them of the existence of God. Like, I think there was this one woman, like, she was an atheist blogger for years. And then when she had a child and she looked at that child, that convinced her to believe in God. And then Francis Collins, in his book, The Language of God, he talks about, like, oh, I think he looked at a frozen waterfall and that convinced him to believe in God. Sometimes I think people leave out those other parts of what goes into human cognition. And I think those should be given more weight, if you will. I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
I think you're right.
Yeah, I mean, if we take the convertibility of the transcendental seriously, then everyday experiences of beauty and goodness, which seem to point beyond, the everyday realm of creatures, ought to point to a transcendent truth, ought to point to a transcendent being. So yeah, I do think that we do tend to abstract our arguments from the existence of God from lived experiences, which do point us to God. Not just religious experience, but aesthetic and moral experiences as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think there is with philosophy, there's a tendency, obviously, because it's philosophy, to abstract, and sometimes too much abstraction leaves you devoid of the humanness aspect, because you're doing it ultimately. You're doing philosophy, to become a better. I would say to become a better human through your understanding of through your love of wisdom, and if you want to be virtuous, whatever you want to put in that place. but too much abstraction, I think there is a tendency for too much abstraction within philosophy, and then the philosophers end up not having any soul in the game. They're just like talking abstractly from like 10,000 feet in the air, like, yes, let me pontificate on this and just fly over to the next subject.
Oh, and just I wanted to mention another point too. I don't know if you watched this video when Rob Coons and Graham Opie debated each other on Joe Schmid's channel, The Majesty of Reason. But they had this debate, and so Opie begins by saying, "Look, what you want to do is reduce kind of appeal to brute facts, right?" So he says you want to reduce the appeals to unexplained necessities, right, and so forth. So basically, reducing brute facts, and then at the end, Rob Coons says, well, look, think about it, right? Isn't my explanation simpler because I'm just talking about one causal agent who produces, right, the entire cosmos, and this causal agent has within him the features, to have this proportionate effect, if you will, right, consciousness and so forth. Doesn't it seem to be the case that Opie has to have all these brute necessities, these brute kind of, let's see here. Like for instance, there's not one simple, but there are multiple simples on Opie's theory at the bottom of reality, right? And so forth, right? So not just one simple. And there was a point where I think, Opie kind of, this was in response to Alex Pruse's and Rob Coons' paper on the PSR. And I think Rob Coons called Opie out for his response to the argument was like question begging, or not question begging. He said it's worse than question begging. It's foot stomping. And then Opie was kind of like foot stomping, and then he was caught off guard. But I really think that at that moment for me, it kind of sealed the deal that, okay, yeah, there's a lot of just, even in Opie's debate against Craig on the argument from mathematics, right? There's just always an appeal to like, okay, I'm going to stop the analysis here. This is as far as it can go. But at some point, right, I think at some point what you'll find is that theism is the simplest explanation of reality, and it reduces all those kind of jarring appeals to using brute necessities or even brute contingencies, right, as the ultimate foundation of reality. That's at least my thought, right? Seeing Rob Coons in action and Craig too kind of really increased my confidence that, okay, we're probably on better ground than we think we are. And I don't know, I think naturalism seems simple, but when you look at it, it's actually a very complex and jagged theory.
Yeah, I'd have to watch this debate between Coons and Opie.
Yeah, you'll love it. You'll love it. Yeah. Okay, so let's just talk about this final bit, and then we can conclude the episode. So I'm interested on, let's say that you're dealing with doubts, or someone you know is dealing with doubts about the existence of God. How would you approach that situation, or what helps you kind of grapple if you have doubts?
Yeah, IJ, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I think for me, I had this a few years ago. We had, to cut the story, to keep the story very short, my son passed away. And when that happened, there was a moment where I thought, and this was in the middle of I was writing my thesis. I was in the middle of writing my problem of evil, and then my son dies. So it really put my skin in the game about what I was saying. So I went back on what I was writing to, and it made me reflect on what I was writing and to see, okay, do I really think the arguments that I'm presenting in here for the existence of God and the fact that evil happens, it necessitates the existence of God. Is my argument sound? And if it's sound, do I really believe it? Because you could present a sound argument, but you don't necessarily have to believe it at all. Or if you do it, you're just kind of presenting it with no skin in the game. You're just like, here you go. And so for me, for quite a few months, I would say, after and during and after it all, I always thought, okay, do I really believe in God? And so when I went back, as I was rewriting it, through my rewriting and doing a better job in researching, I would say, just reading more literature, I became convinced. My doubt, I would say, my doubt disappeared because, to put it bluntly, because of the thesis that I was writing. And the thesis was, that evil necessitates God, and that was a tough pill to swallow for me, because you want to understand when evil happens. You want to understand why it's happening. And for me, that in my opinion, I don't know if you can ever really explain evil in any sort of way. You could present possibilities. Okay, it happened maybe because of this. It happened maybe because of, but to give a certitude, a certain answer, a very firm answer, it seems impossible. So it was a very difficult pill for me to swallow a few years ago when I came to the point, it's like, okay, well, I do believe God exists, and I do believe that evil necessitates God's existence, and evil has happened to me, but that is not reason enough for me to reject my belief in God. So I would say, this is one of those times where the argument I was presenting, I hold to, and I hold to firmly, even having gone through something difficult. So I would say that that's the way I would put it.
So you would say, so someone, let's say, is having doubts, or even in your life, right, when you had questions, what you had to do was kind of calm down and have your intellect kind of order the emotions, right? So it's not the case that the emotions were so volatile that they controlled reason, but that you were trying to create that harmony between reason and emotion first, right? So, that's good
correct.
advice.
I think that it is certainly very difficult when you're going through something difficult, because obviously all you want to do is, swear and just be very angry, and that's perfectly normal human reaction to something evil, something terrible, something terrible befalls you. If you don't react in such a manner, I would say that's something's wrong with you. And so it is a very normal reaction. If someone were to go through something difficult right now, and it's very normal for people, I would say, for humans to have this strong emotion, a strong sense of loss, a strong sense of anger, a strong sense of confusion. It's all very normal, but ultimately emotions go away, emotions do fade, but at the point in which your emotions are highest, one must remember that the decision you end up making should not be based on the emotion itself. It should be based on whether what you're feeling is intellectually, maybe so that's what intellectually sound. And for me, intellectually, I knew that God existed, and my whole point was trying to prove that. But emotionally, I didn't feel that way at all. Emotionally, I was like, F you. So it is very difficult. There's no easy way to this. There's no easy way to be like, if you're going through it, there's no easy way to be like, okay, I'm going to take my emotion, put it in a jar. All right, intellect, rule it. It's very difficult to do, and it's just something that you would have, something that you just have to do, but it's very difficult to do. That would be my advice, if that's any good advice at all.
All right, Amos.
Yeah, there's all sorts of different doubts that one might have concerning the existence of God, or one's assent to Christianity or a particular denomination. Augustine has an interesting argument in De Doctrina Christiana, where he talks about we're not often rationally justified in in the everyday beliefs we hold. So he gives the example of whether he can know the woman he knows as his mother actually gave birth to him. He doesn't have the memory. He wasn't fully conscious at the time. So how does he know? He needs to be able to assent to a just teacher. And so, there's a need to look for just authority that in other ways evidences its ability to to preserve the truth and to present the truth. And Augustine develops this and says, well, this is why I have faith in the church's teaching. And not everyone might assent to that in the same way, but I think we can also look at it historically and just say, look, the traditions that we've inherited from the past have given us many of the truths that we just take for granted. So I don't really know the history of say, how the theory of the atom developed. I understand that it went through various complicated phases. There's all sorts of different models, and the sort of little particulates or little balls of matter bumping up against each other. It doesn't really hold anymore with string theory and whatnot. But there still is a certain amount of say scientific knowledge that tradition has passed down and that we've inherited. And when we look at institutions like say the church has preserved quite a bit of truth from classical culture, its own philosophical developments throughout history. And so there, the argument, there's not an argument from tradition. It is like a informal fallacy to, if someone asks for evidence, to just say, well, this is what the church has always believed, or this is what Western civilization has always believed. But I think it does say that, people have wrestled with these ideas throughout the years. They've come up with good reasons. There's a, massive canon of philosophy and theology that might be able to help me through some of these issues. And so I ought to give tradition a certain amount of weight as a teacher, which has given me, so many things, so many social institutions, scientific institutions, and other truths and things that exist in my everyday life that I do take for granted.
It sounds like you're making an argument from trust, right? Yeah, basically. Yeah. Okay. So, let's see here. If you don't mind, I can say my bit, and then we can wrap up the episode, or we can we can talk a little bit about this. Just
Yeah, if you want to get into it.
Yeah, I mean, I really like how both of you guys kind of touched on points that I was going to make, right? So, for instance, IJ. Well, so basically, I was going to emphasize three things. One is that, when it comes to doubts, one is that in order to handle doubts, you need to be a good reasoner. You need to be a good thinker, right? And what I mean by that is that you need to, faith is an art. It's not this kind of undisciplined, emotional sort of, I go with the flow. If I'm at a Hillsong concert and I feel God, then he's real. It's not like that. Faith is not like that. And especially for those, a lot of Christians who have lost the faith, they talk about how they were raised with that kind of faith, where it was like, oh, if I feel it, then it's real and it's in the music, right? And there's validity there, I think, personally, right, in experiencing God in music and in emotions. But there has to be that intellectual kind of foundation as well. So one thing is developing the values and disciplines of a good reasoner, right? So controlling the emotions, but also understanding what the emotions are telling you. I remember when I went through my period of doubt, William Lane Craig, he told me, oftentimes doubts about the existence of God come from a faulty view of God, right? So oftentimes what you've done is you presupposed, or somewhere in your thinking and in your life, a really bad idea about God kind of slipped into your life. And then now, the disease is kind of spreading and you're recognizing it, right? So there's that kind of time where you need to, take a break from theology. Don't read philosophy all the time, take a time to just take care of yourself, right? When Elijah was in the desert, God told him, just get up and eat. He didn't immediately give him some grand revelation, right? So developing that kind of view of yourself, of where you discipline yourself as a thinker, but also the second point I was going to make is that, when you think about God, right, God's not just some abstract concept. If you do end up believing in God, right, it's really going to pull in all of who you are. It's going to pull in your intellect. It's going to pull in your heart, your soul, your mind, your body. It's going to pull in your deepest fears, your deepest wants, the things that you fundamentally believe in. So then if you're having problems dealing with God, then, one of the questions you can ask, and I think this is why, people sometimes dismiss Pascal's suggestion that you should go out and, live as a Christian, right? But I think that's actually really significant. Going out, listening to music, going out, spending time with Christians, going out, talking to people who have strong faiths, right? Or even, sometimes for people, what does it in for them is listening to Bach or Beethoven. And that's like, okay, I'm at intellectual 50-50. Now I can come over to God, right? So just acknowledging that reason is not, belief in God and reason is not just this isolated, abstract endeavor. The last thing too is, being charitable. I think that's a value that's really underplayed and undervalued. But when you really try to look at your opponent in the strongest light, you try to go out and seek the truth. And you know, when you really do that, and you say to yourself, look, I'm not trying at this point to prove anything that I want to be true, right? But I just really just want the truth. At that point, I think you're at your intellectual peak where you can learn a lot. And, you know, personally, in my life, you know, I was at a point in high school when I was agnostic, right, where I was just totally confused and lost, and then I had to take a break, you know, and stop thinking about theology, stop thinking about philosophy. And then I spent time talking to really intelligent atheists. I spent time talking to really intelligent Christians. And then eventually over time, I just found that my belief in God had quietly returned.
Mm.
And then from there, I just said, okay, you know, God, if you're real, show it, right? And then from then on, you know, there were religious experiences, there's the experience of beauty. And there was just also the realization that I find atheism really ugly and unpleasant. But then I found that in Christianity, it not only, you know, C.S. Lewis has this quote, I believe in God, or, you know, I think it's something like, I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but by it I see everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And when I thought about that, that actually just made a lot of sense to me. And I don't know how else to put it, but when I looked at like, when I tried to be charitable to theists and to atheists, and I looked at the arguments, I just found the theistic arguments more convincing each time. And I mean, that's just my bit. What, I went on for like 3 minutes, right? Sorry about that. I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I would agree with you. I would also, I think there is something to the effect of being charitable that is quite underestimated right now. I mean, we have Peter Singer's altruism becoming the forefront, as opposed to Christian charity, which was always at the forefront. And I think just charity in general is much needed in, you know, when you're dealing with doubt. And to the point about Amos's tradition, human beings are such that we only exist for like 85 years max, maybe 100 if you're really lucky. And in those years, if you lived up to 100 years and your brain is working perfectly well, you really only start thinking when you're like 18, 16, let's just say 16. So you don't have all the time in the world to consider all the possible explanation arguments. So you do intuitively lean on tradition in your everyday life. We do that all the time. You know, I honestly, I've told Amos this, I honestly cannot, I couldn't convince a flat earther why the earth is not flat with like, I would say I wouldn't be able to convince him at all whatsoever. But I disagree with him more so because I place my trust in the scientists that have done the work, and and that's just the way you go. And so same with faith, there is that sense in which the church is, at least within Christianity, it has existed for 2,000 years. These people aren't dumb, you know, they just didn't come up one day with this stuff. And so you do have to place some sort of value in that institution, I would say.
All right, Amos, do you want to give the last word?
Sure. At the beginning of the episode, you mentioned that you were a democratic socialist.
Yeah.
And, you know, there is a huge drive in that movement towards, you know, empathy and sympathizing with the poor. And just to maybe tie it all together, like when it comes to history, many of the ethical assumptions and behavioral assumptions that we make are ones that have been bequeathed to us by Christianity. So yeah, there, you know, in having the amount of intellectual charity that we ought to is something that was developed by Christian virtue theorists. Even if we come to doubt Christianity, we still swim in its waters, and so it's still worth taking seriously, just for that reason alone.
Yeah. All right. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on to the show. Thank you, IJ. Thank you, Amos. Once again, this is Kazingram Dialogue, talking to Intellectual Conservatism today. I think we're planning on having me come onto their channel next time, so I'm excited. We'll see what we'll talk about then, but thank you so much, guys.
Thank you for having us,
thank
man.
you.
This was awesome.